sometimes social systems change even when the environment's not changing. And you can create a rapid change in your environment just by having some property that causes things to go through a phase transition. And so in social networks, for example, you might have five friends, but each of them also has five friends, and each of them has five friends. And so you can reach a critical point where when one person changes their behavior, it can spread to thousands of other people in a network.
I think a lot of our intuition is based on thinking of nature as having a kind of continuous character. So if you take a pencil and you bend it slightly, it bends. You push a little bit harder and it bends a bit further. There's a direct link between what you do and what you get out. There's a cause and effect relationship. So small causes should have small effects, big causes have big effects. But what crises are, and what science has realized, is that the world is kind of full of systems that don't work that way. So your pencil, if you bend it far enough, will suddenly and abruptly snap. So it goes into a total different regime of behavior. And understanding these kind of points where the behavior goes from one kind of thing it's very predictable and understandable to a totally different kind of scenario is what a lot of science is now trying to understand. You have these crises in financial systems. You have sudden traffic jams on the internet or on the roads. You have collapse of populations in ecosystems and that kind of thing. All these systems have points where they can go from one kind of qualitative behavior to another kind of behavior, and it's very difficult to see these crisis points coming in advance.
The concept of crisis for me is the idea that when you apply a small perturbation, you might, for instance, insert just a single infected individuals in a population. If you are in a certain range of parameters, you can create macroscopic effects. So basically, to small perturbation, to small changes of the system, you get microscopic and dramatic changes to the entire system. And that's a typical example of crisis. In epidemiology, for instance, this is related to the concept of epidemic threshold and the fact that if the disease has enough spreading velocity, it can pervade the entire system, even if you just insert a few infected individuals.
Well, I think the best metaphor, perhaps, is that of the avalanche. The idea that there may be a point at which there is an abrupt change in social systems, so that, say, a social movement occurs, so that the system changes. Thus, for example, one of my articles looked at the change of the trading system in Europe in the 1860s, and it turned out that there's just a little change in 1860, the signing of one treaty, which I argued caused the signing of a bunch more treaties, and the whole system changed, and then it sort of reached an equilibrium where it was quite stable for some time thereafter.
Complex systems like social systems or traffic systems are characterized by a nonlinear dynamics. That means effects are not necessarily proportional to the courses. And that means that large impacts on the system can have small effects, or small impacts can have large effects. So small changes can drive the system towards instability. And then when a certain so-called tipping point is crossed, the system becomes unstable and a completely different system behavior shows up. Some examples are stop-and-go traffic that is suddenly occurring in smooth traffic flow, or the breakdown of financial markets, for example, or the outbreak of a social revolution.
We have investigated the abrupt changes in two systems, the earthquake and the financial markets, and in both cases we found some regularities. And the regularities are with respect to the time scales which are observed for the system to recover back to the typical situation. In both cases, the recovery is not governed by a typical scale, but rather there is a multiplicity of time scales. And this is something which is, in our opinion, a manifestation of the complexity of the system. When this happens, there is a recovery to the normal state, which is a power law recovery in time. But the power law is just the evidence of a multiplicity of time scales.
Well, in the case of language, you'll sometimes have catastrophes that language is disappearing, or that new languages are forming because of populations coming together, like in Creole languages. But in general, in language, there's a very slow, not so slow, but there is a continuous adaptation in order to deal with gaps that occur in the language. So new words appear, new sounds appear, new concepts appear. And so it's a kind of gradual evolutionary process, generally.
My research falls in two areas. One is economics, and the other is liquids, such as water. You might think that these two systems have very little to do with each other, but in fact they do. And the reason is that both are dependent entirely upon very abrupt transitions. Certainly this is true in economics. What matters in economics are the abrupt changes. That's what all the attention is focused on. And also in liquids, the change of phase of one liquid form, such as water, to another liquid form, such as steam, when we boil water, is of fundamental importance, not only scientifically, but even mechanically. Engines are called steam engines, are the basis of almost all of transportation for many, many, many years.
Right. Actually, that is a central theme of my work. In practice, we have first worked on lakes, and the general idea of a critical point is that if you change gradually the conditions of the systems, when it reaches a critical point, very little is needed to make it tip into a completely different state. In the case of lakes, we've seen that they can tip from a clear to a turbid state, for instance. But the latest thing that we're working on now is the onset of migraine attacks, which are also critical transitions, but in the brain tissue.
The notion of transition or crisis has a very sharp definition in the context of physics. It means that as you change some control parameter in a physical system, could be the temperature, the pressure, could be in a financial market, could be the inflation rates in an economic system, could be the growth rate of an economy and so on. You see an abrupt change from one condition to the other. An example, you have a piece of ice, you start heating it up, you hit 0 degrees Celsius, and suddenly the ice becomes water. It doesn't become water before, and it doesn't become water, vapor afterwards. So that is what a concept of crisis or the transition is. Now, the notion of crisis has more of a psychological component, and in many situations, in social situations and so on, we see that the change of some underlying set of conditions, not just one, many, can lead to a very sharp change in the qualitative properties of a social system. For example, a society that is affluent suddenly under certain kinds of changes could collapse. There are many examples of the collapse of many civilizations that were abrupt in the sense that over the many centuries over which we study them, a very short period of time occurred during which they moved from one state to the other.
One of the biggest surprises to me was the absence of critical points and absence of sudden transitions in complex systems. Much of the hypothesis of early network theory was that networks emerged through a sudden network transition, that is the sudden phase transition, in which nodes that previously were disconnected suddenly become connected. What we learned in the last decade is that's not the case. Rather, networks emerge through gradual addition of nodes and links, and there is no magical moment before which there is no network and after which there is a network. Similarly, when it comes to tipping points, a very popular concept out there, one thing we learned through the work of Alessandro Vespignani is that when it comes to the spreading of ideas or viruses in networks, there is no tipping point, because even very weakly virulent ideas and viruses could actually spread to a certain degree. So if anything, the modern complexity theory was a theory of the absence of tipping point, of the absence of phase transitions, despite the importance of the concept in general of understanding material systems and so on.
Let's consider, for example, a lake, a pristine lake with lots of species, clean waters, high diversity, and so on. Imagine now that we increase nitrogen in this lake. At the beginning, nothing happens. We keep introducing more and more nitrogen, and it seems that this doesn't affect the lake. However, once we reach a critical point, slight increase in the amount of nitrogen is going to change completely the state. We'll move from that pristine lake to one characterized by a much lower diversity of species, turbid waters, dominance of a few species. There's been a huge transition. This is an example of big changes in ecology. These changes are not smooth, are not linear, but we reach these points in which there's a sudden shift to a contrasting state. One of the challenges we are facing right now in relation to global change is trying to anticipate the existence of these critical points before they are reached.